we've all heard the news. Elon Musk has a bold plan to help our country get out of our national debt issue. And clearly, Elon is a very, very smart guy, but candidly, his plan's a little bizarre. And before I go into why I think it's bizarre, we need to delve into the issue a little bit first. So if you look at our budget from last year, 2023, you can see the government took in $4.4 trillion, but we spent $6.1 trillion. We're going to come back to this chart in a minute, but just super high level. I don't want to keep this complicated, but from an income standpoint, where does the income for the government come from? About half of it comes from you and I, from our Social Security tax. Another 35% comes from the Social Security and the Medicare tax that we pay. Another 10% comes from corporate taxes, and then 5% from other sources. And what are our expenses? About 20% of our expenses are for Social Security, 25% are for Medicare and Medicaid, about 15%, and we're going to delve into this, is interest on our debt, which is one of the things that Elon and the rest of us are all worried about, because the interest makes all of this worse. Another 15% goes to the military, another 10% goes to income security, and then finally 15% goes to other programs. And unfortunately, that deficit, right, we saw that the government is spending a little over $6 trillion. We're taking in about $4.4 trillion. So that $1.7 trillion, unfortunately, that number's getting worse. In fact, if we look at the government debt that the public owns, it went from 26.5 trillion just 12 months ago to 28.5 trillion, an increase of $2 trillion. That's a lot of money. And right now, the interest, a lot of that debt was financed when interest rates were lower. And as that debt matures, as we need to renew that debt, we need to roll it over, it's likely going to be rolled over at a higher interest rate, which means the problem gets worse and worse. And you can see, according to the Peterson Foundation, this is where we're at now, and this is where they're projecting us to be. And so, and that's just the net interest costs. That's not the additional debt that we're taking on in financing to get our expenses under control. Okay, so what does this mean to you and I? This is the national debt. This is according to the usdebtclock.org. You can see, and when I took this screenshot, it was a little over $36 trillion. But importantly, I want to take you to the category to the right, which is almost $107,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. That's an enormous amount. And per taxpayer, it's over $250,000. So let's just do this per citizen, per man, woman, and child in the United States. At $107,000, at just 5% interest, that is $5,000 a year coming from every man, woman, and child. So for a family of four, that is $20,000 in the median household income. For both people that are working, if there's two people in the household, the median household income is only about $75,000 in the United States. So let's say that the take-home pay after taxes is $60,000. Well, for a family of four, the interest alone on that payment on the national debt is $20,000, which is a third of what the after-tax take-home pay is for the average U.S. household. So Elon is right, and we are all right to be worried about what's going on. Okay, so why do I say Elon's plan is bizarre? The reason I say it's bizarre, let's go back to this Congressional Budget Office chart where I showed that the revenues were $4.4 billion. And the expenses, the outlays was trillion. These are trillions, not billions. 4.4 trillion. So we have a gap of 1.7 trillion. But let's look at these expenditures. And going back to that chart that we talked about earlier, where I had the expenses, Social Security, that's mandatory. Medicare and Medicaid, mandatory. Interest on the debt is mandatory. We can argue about whether the military is mandatory or not, but let's call it mandatory. Income security is kind of mandatory. So most of this is mandatory. And if we look at this chart from the Congressional Budget Office, they would say of the $6.1 trillion, that $3.8 trillion is mandatory. Now, I want you to notice that the net interest is not in mandatory. Now, technically, it may not be mandatory, but some really bad things would happen if we didn't pay that interest. So we really have $4.5 trillion of mandatory expenses and $1.7 trillion of discretionary. So what makes this bizarre? Now, I am rooting for Elon, and he's a smart guy, right? Reusable rockets. I remember when I first heard that, I was like, oh, my undergrad's in engineering. And it's like, whew, that would be a tough challenge for anybody to do it. But you know what? They're doing it on a regular basis now, right? These rockets that used to launch the vehicle up into space and then they would land and become trash in the ocean. Now they're coming back down and being reused. And the electrification of cars, I know this is controversial, whether people want to drive electric cars or not, but they're out now and we have a choice. And Tesla is making these cars profitably. And not only is SpaceX capturing this rocket, but they are doing things that few of us thought SpaceX would be able to do a decade ago. So I am cheering from the sidelines for Elon, but I know he has publicly said that he wants to cut $2 trillion a year out of the budget. What I think would be and who am I, but what I think would be a more logical goal would be to say, you know, we're going to cut that out of the government deficit. Not necessarily out of the budget, but we're going to look at the revenue generation. We're going to look at the expense side of things, and we're going to try to figure out, you know, how can we first? The first job is to quit spending more than we bring in. How can we do that in a way that doesn't overly tax the American citizens of this country? Because you can see that individual income tax is already half of the government's revenue. And I think many of us look at our tax bill and say, okay, we're probably fairly taxed for what we receive in benefits. Now, the United States, believe it or not, has a relatively low tax burden, but the government also doesn't provide many of us with health care, right? Most of us that are working are getting our health care not from the government, but from our employer's health care plan. So yes, if you look at other developed countries, we're on the lower side of the tax rates, but we're also getting less for that money. So I wish Elon all the best, but it is a little bit bizarre. We all need to make good decisions. And that's why I made this video up here that talks about one of the biggest decisions we all have to make, which is when do we retire? This video is why waiting to retire until 65 might be a big mistake. I'll see you in it. Thanks for watching this one.